The women had been standing in line for nearly an hour. Cold air pressed through their thin coats as they watched American soldiers move between field kitchens with an ease that felt unreal. The smell alone was overwhelming. Warm, rich, unfamiliar. Not the sharp scent of boiled turnips or watery soup they had known for years, but something heavier, comforting. One of the women whispered, almost embarrassed, "What is that smell?" No one answered. They were afraid to hope. When their turn came, a young American cook smiled and held out a metal tray. On it sat a split biscuit, soft, pale, and steaming. Then he did something that made several of them freeze. He took a ladle and poured thick gravy over the bread. One woman recoiled slightly. "Gravy? On bread?" she muttered in disbelief. In their world, gravy was rare. Bread was precious. You didn't waste one on the other. Another woman laughed nervously. "Is this a joke?" The cook didn't understand the words, but he understood the hesitation. He gestured gently and said, "Eat, it's good." They sat down on rough wooden benches, holding the plates like fragile objects. No one took the first bite. Finally, the oldest woman broke off a small piece, just a taste, only to see. The moment the food touched her mouth, her face changed. Her hands began to tremble. She swallowed, and then covered her mouth. Tears welled up instantly. "It's warm," she whispered, "and soft." Another woman took a bite, then another. Within seconds, the silence broke, not with laughter but with quiet sobbing. Shoulders shook, heads bowed. A few women pressed their palms against their eyes, trying not to cry in front of strangers. For the first time in years, the food didn't feel like survival. It felt like kindness, and none of them were prepared for what that meant. No one stopped them when they asked for more. That alone felt unreal. In the camps they came from, asking twice meant punishment, or worse, laughter. But here, the American cook simply nodded and scooped another ladle of gravy, this time heavier, slower, as if he understood something sacred was happening. The women ate more carefully now, not hungrily, reverently. One of them closed her eyes after every bite, as if afraid the taste might disappear if she looked away. Another broke her biscuit in half and stared at the steam rising from it, whispering, "I forgot food could smell like this." For years, eating had been mechanical. You swallowed because you had to. You didn't think. You didn't feel. But this forced memories back to the surface. A small kitchen, a wooden table, a mother brushing flour from her hands, a morning before uniforms, before alarms, before loss. One woman suddenly pushed her plate away. The others froze, afraid she was sick. Instead, she pressed her forehead to the table and began to cry. Not quietly this time, but in deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere far older than hunger. "I remembered my sister," she said between breaths. "She used to bake bread like this, before everything ended." No one tried to stop her. An American soldier nearby turned away, pretending not to see. Another slowed his steps. A third quietly placed an extra biscuit on the edge of the table without saying a word. The women noticed. That gesture, small, silent, broke something open. One by one, they realized the tears weren't about the food. They were about what the food represented. For the first time since the war began, someone had given them more than survival. They had been given dignity, and none of them yet understood how deeply that single meal would change what came next. The meal should have ended there. Plates scraped clean, cups drained, guards calling for movement, but no one rushed them. The women noticed it almost at the same time. Time itself seemed to loosen. No shouted orders, no counting, no threats. The Americans moved around them, talking quietly, laughing among themselves, treating the moment as ordinary. That was what felt most unsettling. One woman leaned closer to the others and whispered, "Why are they acting like we're people?" No one answered right away. Across the yard, a group of American soldiers stood near the field kitchen. One of them gestured toward the women's table and said something the prisoners couldn't hear. Another shrugged, then smiled. Not mockingly, not with pity, but casually, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. That smile stayed with them. Back home, they had learned to keep their eyes down. Looking up invited trouble. Looking at soldiers meant fear. Here, when one of the women accidentally met an American's gaze, he nodded. Just once. It wasn't permission. It wasn't command. It was acknowledgement. The women sat straighter after that. They began to talk. Not about the war, not about losses, but about things they hadn't dared to say aloud in years. How long it had been since they felt full. How strange it was to eat without rushing. how heavy their hearts felt now that they remembered what normal once meant. One woman touched her sleeve, fingers tracing the worn fabric. "I thought when the fighting stopped," she said quietly, "the fear would stop too." Another shook her head. "No, but maybe this is how it starts." A whistle blew in the distance. Movement orders would come soon. Yet before they were led away, one of the American cooks raised his voice, not sharply but firmly, and spoke to the guards. There was a brief exchange, a pause, then the guards stepped back. 5 more minutes. The women didn't say anything. They didn't need to. They simply sat there, breathing in warmth, holding on to a moment that felt dangerously close to hope. None of them knew it yet, but that meal would be remembered long after the camp itself faded from memory. That night, long after they were marched back to their quarters, no one slept. The warmth of the meal still lingered, not in their stomachs, but in their thoughts. The barracks were quiet except for the sound of breathing and the occasional shift of straw. Usually, hunger kept them awake. This time, it was something else. Memory. One woman lay staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment the American soldier had nodded at her. Such a small gesture. Yet, it had unsettled her more than any shouted order ever had. "I think they see us differently," she whispered into the darkness. Someone scoffed softly from the other side of the room. "They're just guards," another woman said. "Don't forget where we are." But even she didn't sound convinced. The next morning, the women lined up again, bracing themselves for disappointment. Moments like yesterday didn't repeat themselves in wartime. They were accidents, miracles that vanished as soon as you expected them. Yet, when they reached the yard, the field kitchen was already smoking. The same cook stood there. This time, he didn't wait for confusion. "Breakfast," he said slowly, clearly, pointing toward the table. Not leftovers, not scraps. Breakfast. The women exchanged glances, uncertain whether to move. One of them took a step forward, then stopped. Conditioning was hard to break. The cook noticed. He set down the ladle, walked closer, and spoke gently, choosing his words carefully. "You don't have to rush." That sentence landed heavier than any ration. They sat again at the table, hands folded, unsure what to do with themselves now that fear wasn't steering every motion. One woman noticed her hands were no longer shaking. Another realized she wasn't counting bites. Around them, life in the camp continued as usual, but something invisible had shifted. The women weren't being watched as closely. The guards didn't bark. The soldiers passed by without tension in their shoulders. For the first time since capture, the women began to wonder, not what would happen to them tomorrow, but who they might still be when the war finally ended. Weeks later, when the trucks finally arrived, the women were ready to leave. Not because they wanted to, but because they understood they could. The camp looked smaller than it once had. The fences were still there. The guards still counted heads. The war had not magically ended overnight. Yet, something fundamental had shifted in the way the women carried themselves. They stood straighter now. As they waited, one of the women held onto a folded piece of cloth. Inside it, carefully wrapped, was half a biscuit from that first morning. Saved, dried, almost crumbling. She hadn't kept it out of hunger. She had kept it as proof. Nearby, the American cook watched from a distance. He didn't approach. He didn't wave. He simply nodded once, the same way he had on that first day. This time, she nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Later, long after the camp disappeared behind them, the women would struggle to explain what had happened there. They wouldn't talk about uniforms or fences or even captivity. They would talk about breakfast, about how someone had looked at them and seen people instead of prisoners, about how warm food reminded them they still belonged to the world, about how dignity could return in the most ordinary form. Years later, one of them would tell her child, "The war didn't end for me when the fighting stopped." She paused, remembering the steam, the silence, the kindness. It ended the day someone shared their food and didn't ask for anything in return.